Good morning, RockChurch. How are you today? It's good to see you. Thanks for coming out to church today and joining us. Wasn't that worship awesome? It was an awesome time with the Lord. I love it. Well, my name is Theresa. I'm the community pastor here at RockChurch, bringing you a message today. I want to start off by saying that the name of the message is Perhaps. Everyone say Perhaps. Our office manager, Jessica, texted me early in the week and said, hey, can you tell me the name of your message so I can put it together with all of our stuff? And I said, Perhaps. And she didn't say anything back, so I was like, cool, she knows. So then I get to staff meeting, and she's like, hey, can you tell me the name of your message? And I was like, Perhaps. And then at the end of the meeting, she said, like, seriously, I need to know the name of your message. She truly did not know what I was doing. And I wasn't doing it on purpose. Like, I just answered her question, so. Have you noticed lately that people in general are incredibly easily offended? Anybody notice that? It's been this way for a long time, but I feel like we're like at an all-time high of people being offended at every little thing. And they also don't just get offended, but they make sure that everyone knows about it, right? They want everybody to know how offended they are. It seems like you could say just about anything, whether in person or online, and somebody someplace is going to be offended by it. Let me give you an example. I'm going to make a statement that will make some of you feel deeply offended. You ready? All right. Pineapple absolutely belongs on pizza. It is delicious. All right, okay. All right. So we're deeply divided on the issue. How many of you threw up in your mouth a little bit? All right. Okay. That's a silly thing, right? It's a silly example, but I feel like any topic, you can have two sides, and people will argue about it, and some people will be really offended. There are a lot of hot topics I could bring up that would have people, even in this room, right in church, get up and argue right in the middle because they're offended. Unfortunately, people tend to allow themselves to be led around by their feelings more today than ever. Our culture has begun rewarding hypersensitivity. Somebody speaks up about some way they're offended. Usually they get a reward by people cheering them on and being on their side. And also they get negative attention, but they still get attention from the other side. And so this thing of offense is being rewarded in our culture. It seems that over the past few years, being offended has become the easiest way to garner attention, sympathy, and support. And I think people are becoming addicted to being offended, and it's dangerous. People are constantly offended by things that aren't even meant to be offensive. Instead of trying to understand why somebody said something they did that offends us and giving them the benefit of the doubt that it's not what they intended, we run to being offended. And when people say provocative things that are meant to offend us and get under our skin, we give them exactly what they want when we give them a big offended reaction. So often when we become offended, we let our emotions take over. We're angry. We're righteously angry, we believe. Sometimes we're afraid that we might be proven wrong or we might be made out to be the bad guy. Sometimes we're hurt by an offense and we let it ruin relationships that are truly valuable. We all deal with offenses differently. Some people scream and attack. Some people scheme and plot and conspire to get back at the offending party. And some people, like me, withdraw and hide from the pain of the offense. More mature people try to have open, respectful conversations to reach understanding. One of my favorite books in the Bible shows that people being offended can lead to some really awful consequences. The book is Esther. It's a rarity in the Bible for two reasons. Number one, it's one of only two books in the Bible that bears the name of a woman. And number two, God is not mentioned in the book of Esther even one time in the 10 chapters. Not at all. Esther's in the Old Testament. You find it between Nehemiah and Job. And it's the story of a young Jewish woman whose bravery saved countless of Jewish people from a horrible fate. I can't read all 10 chapters for you here today. I'm going to do some summarizing. I do encourage you to read all of it on your own. It is a great read. It is an incredible story. And while God's not mentioned, he is present and working in all of it. In order to understand what's going on, we got to know a little bit about what happened before the time of Esther. So God's people had been exiled from their homeland, Judah, to Babylon. This was the second exile that happened. The first one was of Israel being conquered by Assyria, and they were exiled. Israel and Judah, Israel was divided into two nations at the time, Israel in the northern kingdom and Judah in the southern kingdom. And so first, Israel was exiled by Assyria, and then 100 years, a little more than 100 years later, Judah was exiled to Babylon. And these two kingdoms, that they were distinct political entities. They had their own rulers and laws. But what had happened was, after many evil and idolatrous kings ruled over the people in both of those kingdoms, it was causing the people to sin and turn away from God. And so these two exiles happened as a direct result of the people's disobedience. God warned them over and over and over through his prophets to turn away from their sin and live God-honoring lives, and they didn't listen. The story of exile happened actually after God's people were allowed to return to their homeland. So there was a time where they were put into slavery, they were taken to Babylon, but there came a time where they were allowed to go back. And that's the story that's told in Nehemiah and Ezra right before the book of Esther. And what's interesting, though, is that many Israelites chose not to return home. They built lives in Babylon. They raised families. They had jobs and homes and friends there, so they stayed. And that's likely the case for this young woman, Esther, at the center of the book that bears her name. As you start reading the book of Esther, you're introduced to the Babylonian king Xerxes. Some translations call him Ahasuerus, so if you have an ESV, that's what he's going to be called. Some scholars think that was a title and Xerxes was his name. I'm going to call him Xerxes today. And King Xerxes held a 6-month-long banquet for all his nobles and officials. That is a party. 6 months? 6 hours into a party, I'm like, I got to go home. But this was a 6-month party. The king was showing off, and it was likely to build his military power. His father had been Darius the Great, and his grandfather had been Cyrus. Cyrus was the king who let the exiles go back to Israel and Judah. But Darius had tried multiple times to conquer Greece, and Xerxes was trying to finish that. And so he was trying to build his military power, and having this big, luxurious banquet, he was trying to get all the people on his side and see his way of thinking. And so after entertaining his nobles and officials for 6 months, he then held a week-long banquet for all the people in the city of Susa. Every person from the greatest to the least was invited to join in this feast in the courtyard of the palace garden, which was decorated beautifully with breathtaking decor. The king told his servants to place no limits on drinking alcohol. Somebody say, uh-oh. Every man could drink as little or as much as he wanted. This would have been seen as a very generous action on the part of the king, because normally people would have to watch the king and drink when he drank. They couldn't drink any less, and they couldn't drink any more. It was a respect thing. And so this would have been something that the people would have been very excited about, because they could drink as much free alcohol as they wanted. So at the same time that King Xerxes was holding a banquet for all the men, Queen Vashti held her own banquet inside the palace for all the women. And we can assume that this banquet that the king had was just for the men, and inside the palace was just for the women. Esther 10, chapter 1, verses 10 through 12 says, on the 7th day of the feast, when King Xerxes was in high spirits because of the wine, he told the 7 eunuchs who attended him to bring Queen Vashti to him with the royal crown on her head. He wanted the nobles and all the other men to gaze on her beauty, for she was a very beautiful woman. But when they conveyed the king's order to Queen Vashti, she refused to come. This made the king furious, and he burned with anger. Here's the first time we see someone getting offended in the book of Esther. Notice this is on day 7 of the banquet, where everyone was drinking as much alcohol as they wanted. It says that the king was in high spirits because of the wine. He was intoxicated. We know he'd been showing off all his wealth and the splendor of his palace for 6 months, and she refused to come. This was the last day. He wanted to end it all with the display of a prized possession, his queen. And she said no. She must have known the kind of man he was, right? She surely would have known that he would be angry if she refused. But I imagine being paraded in front of a courtyard full of drunk men didn't sound like fun to her. She probably was offended at the suggestion that she should come do that. What a lot of Bible scholars say is that it's likely that the king wanted her to come only in her crown. He wanted his naked wife to come and parade in front of a huge crowd of drunk men. I don't know about you, I find that offensive. No wonder she refused. Some Bible scholars believe it may have been that she was pregnant and didn't want to be in the company of drunk men. But whatever the reason, she said no, and she refused, and it deeply offended the king. And his response was to gather 7 noblemen who held the highest positions in the empire, and he asked them what he should do in response to his offense. And the noblemen joined in the king's offense, so now they're offended for him. And they say they fear if their wives and the wives of other men hear that Vashti refused a direct order from the king, that no woman in the empire would respect or obey her husband. And this is how they told the king to respond in Esther 1:19-20. So if it please the king, we suggest that you issue a written decree, a law of the Persians and Medes that cannot be revoked. It should order that Queen Vashti be forever banished from the presence of King Xerxes, and that the king should choose another queen more worthy than she. When this decree is published throughout the king's vast empire, husbands everywhere, whatever their rank, will receive proper respect from their wives. The king made it so, and Queen Vashti was banished, and the decree was made law. Esther 1:22 says, the king sent letters to all parts of the empire, to each province in its own script and language, proclaiming that every man should be the ruler of his own home and should say whatever he pleases. From this one offense, the king ended his marriage and made a law that affected every single marriage in the entire Babylonian empire. Every person in the 127 provinces that he ruled over would be affected because a drunk man made an unreasonable request and his anger burned against his wife. In chapter 2, it says that the king's anger had subsided and his personal attendant suggested that he should search for a new wife, a new queen. And they wanted to scour the empire to find beautiful young virgins for the king to find a new bride. And he was pleased at that suggestion, so he let them put the plan into effect. And this is where Esther enters the story. She was a young Jewish woman who had been raised by her cousin Mordecai. When Esther's parents died, Mordecai had adopted her. And we learn in chapter 2 that her name was actually Hadassah, but she's also went by Esther. And we can assume, scholars say, that Hadassah was probably her given Jewish name, and Esther was possibly a more Babylonian-sounding name that she went by in order to fit into that culture where they lived. Esther was one of the young women who was gathered up to be shown to the king as a prospective bride. The servant in charge of the harem of young women was named Haggai, and he was impressed with Esther. And he gave her special beauty treatments and assigned to her 7 of the best handmaids from the palace to tend to her. Now, God still has not been mentioned, but we can see that there is providence at work here. We don't know much about Esther other than she was Jewish, and she must have been very beautiful. She was favored by an important servant of the king and given special treatment that would give her an edge against the other women in the harem. It might be confusing for us in our time today in the United States of America to understand how Mordecai and Esther reacted to this request of her going to be in the king's harem, because this would change her life forever. And all the women who were gathered up, we don't know how many, it doesn't tell us, but there were probably dozens or even hundreds of young prospective brides that were being brought into the palace. So it's kind of hard for me to go, Mordecai, why didn't you grab your beautiful young cousin and go back to Judah? We don't know why. Well, we know because God's providence was at work, and they did what they were supposed to do, and she went to live in the palace. The thing is, though, what she was facing was any woman who was gathered up and went into the palace, they would go see the king one at a time. And after they saw the king, he would either send them back to the harem or he would choose them as queen. Once they went back to the harem, they would stay there for the rest of their lives. They were no longer virgins. They could no longer be married. And so it was a very scary thing, I would think. But I don't know, maybe that's just their culture and the way they understood it, and they were obeying the king. God had a plan, though. We're going to see that God had a plan. Esther was doing everything she could to present herself as the best option to become queen. She listened to the servant Haggai, and did all he told her to please the king. And Mordecai also told her not to reveal that she was Jewish to anyone. So she kept it a secret. She spent a year preparing for her night with the king, and it all paid off. Esther 2:17-18 says, the king loved Esther more than any of the other young women. He was so delighted with her that he set the royal crown on her head and declared her queen instead of Vashti. To celebrate the occasion, he gave a great banquet in Esther's honor for all his nobles and officials, declaring a public holiday for the provinces and giving generous gifts to everyone. So Esther became queen, and then Mordecai became a palace official. Even after all that, Esther still kept her family heritage and nationality a secret, continuing to follow Mordecai's instructions. Sometime later, Mordecai overheard 2 guards plotting to assassinate the king. He gave the information to Esther, and she told the king about it, giving Mordecai credit for the report. So the king had an investigation done, and it was found that the information was correct, and the guards were executed, and an account of what had happened was recorded in a book of the history of the king's reign. In chapter 3 of Esther, we're introduced to the king's right-hand man, Haman. The king made him the most powerful official in the empire, and we're told that Haman was an Agagite. And that might not mean anything to you, but it's a really important detail that we need to investigate. If we go back to 1 Samuel chapter 15, we're going to see why that matters. This was over 500 years before Esther became queen. God gave King Saul a directive. 1 Samuel 15:2-3 says, this is what the Lord of heaven's armies has declared. I have decided to settle accounts with the nation of Amalek for opposing Israel when they came from Egypt. Now go and completely destroy the entire Amalekite nation, men, women, children, babies, cattle, sheep, goats, camels, and donkeys. God told Saul to partially destroy the Amalekites, right? No. He said to destroy the entire Amalekite nation. Let's see what Saul did in response to God's directive. 1 Samuel 15:7-9 says, then Saul slaughtered the Amalekites from Havilah all the way to Shur, east of Egypt. He captured Agag, the Amalekite king, but completely destroyed everyone else. Saul and his men spared Agag's life and kept the best of the sheep and goats, the cattle, the fat calves, and the lambs, everything, in fact, that appealed to them. They destroyed only what was worthless or of poor quality. Saul disobeyed God and spared King Agag's life. So the Amalekites were not completely destroyed, and Haman, the villain of the book of Esther, was a direct descendant of Agag, who was supposed to be executed. Saul became king around 1052 BC, and Esther became queen around 478 BC. What Saul didn't do resulted in the existence of a very evil man in Babylon over 500 years later. And he was a powerful friend of the king. King Xerxes had commanded all of his officials to bow down when Haman passed by. But Mordecai refused to do so. Some other officials were offended by his refusal, and they tried to force him to bow down, but he still refused, and it's about to get bad for Mordecai. Esther chapter 3, verses 4-6 says, the officials spoke to him day after day, but he still refused to comply with the order. So they spoke to Haman about this to see if he would tolerate Mordecai's conduct, since Mordecai had told them he was a Jew. So they've kept this secret that they're Jewish for a while, but now Mordecai decides to reveal that he's Jewish to these officials. And we can assume the reason he revealed it is because his faith in God would only allow him to bow down to God and the king. And so he was probably telling them, I'm Jewish. I'm not going to bow down to Haman. He's not the king. I bow down to God. I bow down to the king. That's it. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down or show him respect, he was filled with rage. He was super offended. He had learned of Mordecai's nationality through the officials, so he decided it's not enough for me to just hurt Mordecai. He looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire empire of Xerxes. And this is where we see those two offenses. The officials were offended, and then Haman was offended. And so he decided to go ahead and destroy all of the people who were Jewish. That's kind of an overreaction, but he was so offended. Sometimes people overreact when we're offended, don't we? You ever seen some road rage? And you're like, oh my goodness, calm down. That's me. I'm like, if you were in the left lane, I don't mind if you want to drive slow, just get in the right lane, please. I get so offended by people. Road rage is not good, guys. Don't overreact. Haman decided to cast lots. He basically rolled dice to decide when the best month and day would be to take action and have the Jews destroyed. That's some crazy pride that he had. He didn't even go to the king first. He decided on the day of destruction before he even got permission from the king to do it. And then he went to the king and he convinced him that the Jews were refusing to obey his laws and they should all be killed. And he not only asked the king to do this, he also offered 10,000 sacks of silver to the royal treasury for the king to agree. Esther 3:10-11 says, the king agreed, confirming his decision by removing his signet ring from his finger and giving it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. The king said, the money and the people are both yours to do with as you see fit. That's crazy. So on April 17th, the king gave his ring to Haman to seal the edict that gave the order for all Jews in the empire to be killed on March 7th of the following year. Not only would citizens be allowed to kill the Jews, their property would be given to those who killed them. And the order went out, and chapter 3 ends by saying that the king and Haman sat down to drink, and the city of Susa fell into confusion. When Mordecai learned of the decree, he was distraught, and rightly so. He tore his clothes, put on burlap and ashes, and went out into the city, crying with a loud and bitter wail. This is what Jewish people would do when they were in mourning. He went as far as the palace gate, but he couldn't go into the palace because people weren't allowed in while they were wearing mourning clothes. All the Jews in the empire heard of the decree. They fasted, they wept and wailed, and many of them put on mourning clothes too. Esther heard about Mordecai mourning at the gate, and she sent a servant to find out what was going on. Esther was probably living a happy, comfortable life inside the palace. She probably knew very little about what happened outside her little piece of paradise. Mordecai told her through the servant about the upcoming destruction of their people. And he asked the servant to tell Esther to go to the king to plead for her people's lives. And Esther sent this reply in Esther 4:11. All the king's officials and even the people in the provinces know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his gold scepter. And the king has not called for me to come to him for 30 days. So she's faced with the knowledge that every Jew in the Babylonian Empire will be killed. But also she's afraid that if she goes to the king, she could be killed herself. And that's a real thing that happened sometimes. She may have seen it happen a time or two. We know that Xerxes is prone to drunkenness, and he has a bad temper. He's deposed a queen previously. He's bold enough to set this law in motion. So I can understand how she must have been really scared to approach him, knowing that she could quickly and easily be killed on the spot. Esther 4, verses 13-14. Mordecai sent this reply to Esther. Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this? Mordecai sees that the appointment of Esther from a common citizen to a revered queen is no coincidence. It's God's providence. God knew over 500 years prior that Saul's disobedience would lead to a hateful, evil man's plot to destroy his people. And he set things in motion to save them through a young Jewish woman. Esther 4, verses 15-17 says, Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same, and then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I must die. So Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Although God isn't mentioned here, we can assume that Esther was not just asking the Jews to abstain from eating and drinking. Fasting was directly tied to prayer in their faith. She was asking her people to plead with God for her to find favor with the king. She understood that Mordecai was right. It was up to her to do the work that God had set before her. And she would go in to see the king, risking her own life to try and save God's people. Esther 5:1 says, On the 3rd day of the fast, Esther put on her royal robes and entered the inner court of the palace just across from the king's hall. Imagine the faces of the officials in the inner court. They knew the king had a temper. They knew he demanded respect, especially from his wife after what happened with Vashti. I wonder if Esther was holding her breath as she went in. I wonder if the officials were afraid for her, or maybe some of them hoped the king would respond by having her killed. Esther 5:2 says, the king was sitting on his royal throne facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner court, he welcomed her and held out the gold scepter to her. Woo! Oh, he welcomed her. That's good news. Esther 5:3 says, then the king asked her, what do you want, Queen Esther? What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom. Not only did he not have her executed, he offered her whatever she wanted. That's God's favor. Esther didn't waste any time. She made a request that the king and Haman join her for a banquet. The king immediately responded that they would. And so when they got there, the king again asked Esther, because he knew she had a request other than the banquet. He said, what is it that you want? I'll give you up to half the kingdom. And she said, if I found favor with the king, please come with Haman tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for you. Then I will explain what all this is about. It seems like Esther maybe chickened out. I don't know. She had him there. She already had prepared a banquet. You ever hesitated when you knew you needed to do something? You're like, oh, yeah, oh, no, maybe. I'll do it next time. Oh, maybe today. Nope. We all hesitate, right? Like, why didn't she just expose Haman in that moment? Maybe she was scared. She needed another night to fast and pray. We don't know for sure. But as we read on, we're going to see that God had more to accomplish before Esther made her case. So the king agreed that he and Haman would return the following evening for another banquet where he would finally learn what Esther wanted. When Haman left that banquet, he was happy and pleased with himself. But as he exited the palace gate, he saw something that made him furious. He saw Mordecai sitting there. And guess what? Mordecai didn't get up or bow down or honor him in any way. And Haman's anger burned inside of him. Offended again, he went home and he bragged to his friends and his wife about his wealth and his many children. He bragged about the exclusive banquet that he attended with just him and the queen and the king. And he bragged that he had been promoted over all the other officials in the empire. And after he listed all of his accomplishments, he said, all of it is worth nothing as long as Mordecai refuses to honor me. That's crazy. He's got everything. He's got everything. And he can't have this one little thing, this one insignificant Jewish man will not honor him. And so it makes everything else worthless. His friends and family became offended as well. Another offense here we see. And they suggested he should have a 75-foot sharpened pole erected and that he should ask the king to impale Mordecai on it before the next day's banquet so he could go on to enjoy the banquet that Mordecai would be done. So he had a pole put up that night. That's kind of terrifying. Haman didn't even want to wait until the day of destruction. He needed Mordecai dead. He was so offended that he couldn't enjoy all the good things in his life because of Mordecai. You ever know somebody like that? I mean, they got lots of great things going on, but they got this one little thing that's not perfect, and it just bothers them, and it's all they can focus on, and it's all they can think about. They just miss all the blessings because of this one thing that's not going right. I think it's a common issue for people today. Some of us can't enjoy what we have because we're so focused on other people not honoring us in the ways that we think they should, or something that somebody has done for us. It's a toxic way of thinking that poisons the offended person. Haman allowed one person to offend him so badly he couldn't enjoy it. And so the destruction of Mordecai and all the Jews was imminent if Haman had anything to say about it. So again, God not mentioned in the book, but we're about to see his providence displayed. That very night, it just so happened that the king could not sleep. In order to help lull him to sleep, he ordered an attendant to read to him from the book of the history of the king's reign. And it just so happens, as a coincidence, that the attendant turned to the page and read the story of how Mordecai had uncovered the plot to assassinate the king. Upon hearing that account, Xerxes asked what recognition or reward had been given to Mordecai for saving his life. He's like, oh yeah, I remember that. Wait, did we ever thank him? Did we ever do anything for him? And the attendant told him, no, nothing had ever been done to honor Mordecai for what he had done. Oddly enough, at that very moment, Haman had come back to the courtyard to request that Mordecai be killed. The king asked the attendant, who's out in the courtyard? And he was told it was Haman, so the king invited him in. Esther 6:6-10 says, so Haman came in, and the king said, what should I do to honor a man who truly pleases me? Haman thought to himself, whom would the king wish to honor more than me? So he replied, if the king wishes to honor someone, he should bring out one of the king's own royal robes, as well as a horse that the king himself has ridden, one with a royal emblem on his head. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials, and let him see that the man whom the king wishes to honor is dressed in the king's robes and led through the city square on the king's horse. Have the officials shout as they go, this is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor. Excellent, the king said to Haman. Quick, take the robes and my horse and do just as you have said for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the gate of the palace. Leave out nothing you have suggested. Can you imagine what went through Haman's mind? I can't believe his head didn't explode. Just right there, just die. But Haman had to do what the king asked. So the next day, he did everything that the king had detailed for him to do, that he had told the king that he should have done. This was his idea. So he had to go do it. But when Haman went home afterward, he was so dejected and completely humiliated. Can you imagine? So he's there with his friends and his wife, and they tell him, so they've learned that Mordecai's a Jew. Now everybody knows that Mordecai's a Jew. And they said, hey, Mordecai's a Jew. I don't think you're ever going to succeed in your plans against him. They said it would be fatal to continue opposing Mordecai. Just then, the king's servants came to escort Haman to the banquet with Esther and the king. Once both the king and Haman had arrived, Xerxes asked his wife once more, what is your request? Esther 7:3-4 says, Queen Esther replied, if I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people will be spared, for my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I could remain quiet, for that would be too trivial a matter to warrant disturbing the king. The king demanded to know who would do such a thing, and Esther told him that it was Haman. The king jumped up in a rage and went out into the garden. You ever been so mad you just get up and leave the room? He did. He got up and left the room. So after he left, Haman he grew pale and threw himself onto the couch where Esther was reclining to beg her for mercy. But just then, Xerxes came back in, and he saw what he assumed was Haman trying to assault his queen. And he had his attendants come in immediately to take Haman away to his doom. One of the attendants told the king that Haman had erected a pole to impale Mordecai on. And the king ordered that Haman be impaled on that pole instead, and he was. Then the king gave all of Haman's property to Esther, who put Mordecai in charge of all of it. The king gave his signet ring to Mordecai, but Esther was still troubled because of the law that the king had written ordering the destruction of all the Jews in the empire. So she fell at the king's feet and begged him to stop the plot against them. And he told her that the decree was irrevocable because he had sealed it with his signet ring. But he would issue another decree that would give all the Jews the authority to defend themselves and fight for their lives. They were allowed to kill anyone who would try to take their lives and their property. And this decree was issued as law and delivered to all 127 provinces and announced to all the people in the empire. Esther 8:16-17 says, the Jews were filled with joy and gladness and were honored everywhere. In every province and city, wherever the king's decree arrived, the Jews rejoiced and had a great celebration and declared a public festival and holiday. And many of the people of the land became Jews themselves, for they feared what the Jews might do to them. People got saved. There's more to the story, and I would encourage you to get your Bible out and read through the whole book of Esther yourself. It's a fascinating and important part of God's story. We can learn a lot from the book of Esther, but I just have two things I want you to remember today. Number one, being offended can lead to disaster. Taking the time to stop and think before you speak or act can keep that disaster from happening. When we choose to have open, respectful conversations instead of having big offended reactions, that honors God and it honors people. I almost let an offense end a very special friendship of mine. Actually, I did let it end for a time. Somebody I was very close with did something that offended me so deeply and hurt me in a way I didn't think was possible. I was deeply offended actually once and then again a few weeks later. So I had these two offenses that really hurt me in a short amount of time, and I was devastated and confused. And the way I said, like before, the way I respond to being deeply offended, especially by somebody that I care about, is to shut down. It reminds me of when something goes wrong in a machine or a computer and then all of a sudden it's just not working anymore. That's kind of how I am. Like if you've ever seen the blue screen of death on a computer, that is me when I've been offended by somebody. So I simply shut down and I stopped having much to do with this friend. I kept telling myself to get over it, but I couldn't. And I prayed and prayed about it. And I knew that God wanted me to talk to her and fix things. But I was afraid. I was scared that if I reached out, that it would get worse. Right? So I got up the courage at one point to ask her if we could get together. We happened to be in the same place, and I told her, hey, let me know what works for you. She's like, yeah, we can get together. And then I never heard back. So I let it go. A couple times I knew I'd be in the same place as her. I told myself, I'm going to try and find a way. God, give me an opportunity. But it just never worked out to be able to have this conversation. So for 21 months, I let this wall of offense stay between us, and so did she. Because she knew something was wrong. Finally, one day, I prayed about it again because I knew that we were going to be in the same place together. And I asked God, please help me fix it once and for all. I knew there was a chance that talking about it after all this time would end badly. But I was so tired of carrying around this burden of offense. And I was sick of not having this woman in my life the way she had been before. So I found her where I knew she'd be. And I asked her to come with me for a few minutes. And I'm grateful that I did. And I'm grateful that she came. We sat together and I poured out everything to her. I told her how much our friendship had meant to me. And that I was so deeply sorry that I had waited almost 2 years to muster up the courage to talk to her about it. She heard me and she shared her side of things, how I had hurt and offended her as well. And we both said we were sorry, and I felt Jesus lift the burden that I had willingly carried for 21 months. If I'd only had the courage to have an open, respectful conversation when the offenses happened, I wouldn't have had to carry that burden for so long. Maybe you shut down when you're offended. Maybe you have a big, angry reaction. Maybe you try to get back at the person indirectly. But none of those is Christ-like behavior. All of them lead us to places we shouldn't go. They become burdens that we are not meant to carry. So I encourage you to stop the second you find yourself feeling offended and make a better choice that will honor God. Maybe the thing that's offending you isn't worth being offended over and you just need to let it go. But if you can't let it go, I encourage you to ask God how he wants you to respond and do that. It can save a lot of heartache. It's not always going to end the way you hope, but at least you will have done your part and you can move on knowing you did everything you could to fix it. So again, the first point is being offended can lead to disaster if we let it. Number 2, God is at work in your life and you were created for such a time as this. God's not mentioned in the book of Esther, but we can see his hand at work throughout its pages. We can see that God was consistently working for the good of those who love him. God is at work in our lives, and he has work for each of us to do. None of us is Esther or Mordecai, but we can look at the things they accomplished because of their faith in God and their love for God, and we can relate. Although you might not be called to become queen so that you can stop the annihilation of thousands of people, there are things God has set up for you to accomplish. Ephesians 2:10 says, "For we are God's masterpiece. He has created us anew in Christ Jesus so we can do the good things he planned for us long ago." That scripture echoes Mordecai's plea to Esther in chapter 4, verse 14, when he said, "Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for such a time as this?" I say to you today, perhaps you were created for such a time as this. God's providence is all over the book of Esther. He was working through it all to bring about his purposes. Throughout the Bible, you can see the providence of God from the beginning of Genesis to the end of Revelation. He's always been working in this world to reconcile people to himself. From the beginning, he set a plan in motion for us to be saved. Will you stand with me? God made it so simple. Romans 10:9 says, if you openly declare that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Do you believe that Jesus died to pay for your sin? Do you believe that he defeated sin and death and God raised him from the dead? That's all it takes to be saved. If you want to receive that free gift, you can. If you've never really got it before today, and you want to say that Jesus is Lord, and you believe that God raised him from the dead, and you want a relationship with him now and eternity with him in heaven forever, you can do that today. Will you pray with me? God, we thank you so much for the story of Esther and Mordecai. We thank you so much that we don't have to be offended. And when we are, we can choose how we react, and we can be your holy people in the way that we react to being offended. We can honor you in it and give you the glory. If you believe in Jesus and you love him and he is your Lord and Savior, will you repeat after me? Jesus, thank you for living a perfect, sinless life so you would be the perfect sacrifice to pay for all of our sin. Thank you for dying on the cross. Thank you for rising from the grave in victory over death. And thank you for giving us victory over sin and death. Be my King. Be my Lord. Thank you for being my Savior. Holy Spirit, guide me. I know you created me for such a time as this. Help me to accomplish what you have for me. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, we're going to sing one more chorus and Lance will dismiss you. Thank you so much.